The curtain opened, and a hush fell over the room. Everyone expected a cold, clinical end, quick, quiet, routine. But within seconds, that expectation shattered. Murmurs rose, eyes widened, and the chamber transformed into a stage of chaos. What was supposed to be simple turned into a disturbing spectacle, one of the most haunting executions America had ever witnessed. Clayton Lockett did not drift peacefully into death. His body strained, his voice cracked, and every second felt stretched into eternity as witnesses sat frozen, horrified by what they saw. This is the story of Clayton Lockett, a convicted killer whose final 24 hours became a nightmare no one present would ever forget. Clayton Darrell Lockett was born in 1975 in Oklahoma, the son of a fractured home marked by neglect and poverty. From a young age, he witnessed violence in the household, skipped school, and began drifting into petty crime. By his teenage years, he was already experimenting with drugs and breaking into homes, earning a reputation in his neighborhood as reckless and unpredictable. Teachers described him as disruptive and withdrawn, and run-ins with juvenile authorities became frequent. With no stable guidance, his spiral into addiction and criminal behavior only deepened. By his 20s, police knew his name well, a volatile man with a dangerous edge, someone whose path seemed destined for a violent end. In 1999, Lockett committed the crime that would seal his fate, a crime so shocking it reads like the script of a nightmare. Alongside two accomplices, he plotted what they thought would be a simple home invasion in Perry, Oklahoma. The target, a young man rumored to have money and drugs. But when 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman, her friend, and two others unexpectedly walked into the house, the plan disintegrated into savagery. The intruders tied up the victims, pistol-whipped them, and terrorized them for hours. Neighbors later recalled hearing muffled screams. Lockett, drunk on power and rage, escalated the violence. The captives were forced into a truck at gunpoint and driven down dark, empty backroads until they reached a remote, dirt-covered patch of land. There, in the headlights, the terror reached its climax. Stephanie Neiman, barely out of high school, full of dreams for the future, was singled out. After an accomplice helped force her over a fence, he pulled the trigger of his 12-gauge shotgun, the blast tearing into her body. Still alive, gasping in shock, she was dragged to a shallow grave. Witnesses later testified that Lockett stood by and watched coldly as dirt was shoveled over her, burying her alive while she struggled for breath. The brutality of the crime horrified the state, a grotesque display of cruelty that would never be forgotten. Detectives pieced the case together within weeks. Trails of stolen property, fingerprints, and witness testimony led them straight to Lockett. When police finally cornered him, he showed no remorse. His trial in 2000 was swift but brutal in detail. Prosecutors laid out the terror of that night step by step, while witnesses recounted Stephanie Neiman's final moments in harrowing detail. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a unanimous verdict. Clayton Lockett was sentenced to death, his fate sealed by the weight of overwhelming evidence and the shocking cruelty of his crime. For 14 years, Clayton Lockett sat on Oklahoma's death row, and the years did not pass quietly. Guards described him as a constant source of tension, shouting at staff, threatening violence, and sometimes refusing to leave his cell. He developed a reputation for seething anger and a total lack of remorse, which made him one of the most feared inmates on the block. Other prisoners spoke of his outbursts echoing down the hall, a reminder that Lockett's rage was never far below the surface. Appeals came and went, each denial tightening the noose around his future, each one fueling his growing frustration. By 2014, the state was prepared to move forward with his execution. Oklahoma, like many states, was running out of lethal injection drugs. Pharmaceutical companies had stopped selling the chemicals traditionally used, forcing officials to scramble for alternatives. The solution was an untested cocktail of drugs never used before, and Lockett's execution would become the grim experiment that proved just how badly things could go wrong. April 29, 2014, the final day of Clayton Lockett's life. His last hours began with tension. He ordered steak, shrimp, a baked potato, and a Dr. Pepper. But when the tray arrived lukewarm, he shoved it away, refusing to eat. Guards described him as pacing like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, gripping the bars of his cell so tightly his knuckles turned white. He met briefly with his family, a cold and distant exchange, before being led down the long corridor to the death chamber in McAlester, Oklahoma. The shuffle of his chains echoed like a funeral drum beat. At 6:23 p.m., witnesses filed into their seats. Lockett was strapped tightly to the gurney, leather restraints digging into his arms and legs. Prison staff struggled clumsily to find a vein. Needle after needle pierced his skin, leaving bruises, small trails of blood, and angry red welts. He grimaced, cursed under his breath, and the process dragged on for nearly an hour before they finally forced a line into a vein in his groin. The curtain rose. The execution began. The first drug, midazolam, was supposed to sedate him. Instead, it burned through his veins like fire. His face contorted in pain, his eyes wide and darting. His head jerked violently from side to side. He tried to speak, but the words came out slurred, muffled. Witnesses swore they heard him groan. "This shot is fucking with my mind," as his body twisted and strained against the straps. His legs kicked, his chest heaved, and sweat rolled down his forehead. Then came the second drug, vecuronium bromide, meant to paralyze him. Rather than silencing his movements, it locked his muscles in rigid agony. His chest pumped frantically as if he were drowning. The third drug, potassium chloride, began searing through his system, a chemical that burns the veins as it rushes to still the heart. Minutes dragged into eternity. The sedative wasn't working. Instead of fading into unconsciousness, he remained alert and in agony. He writhed on the gurney, gasping and grunting, his muscles convulsing with every failed attempt of the drugs to shut his body down. Behind the curtain, panicked voices whispered, executioners scrambling, unsure what to do. For 43 unbearable minutes, Clayton Lockett's execution played out like a nightmare stretched to breaking point. He groaned and screamed, his body bucking violently against the leather straps, veins bulging, sweat dripping, as the drugs ripped through him without mercy. His eyes rolled back, then snapped open again, as if he were fighting to stay alive. His chest heaved in shallow gasps, every breath a visible battle. Witnesses watched in horror as his skin grew pale, his lips turned blue, and still his body twitched in torment. Finally, after nearly 3/4 of an hour of agony, his face turned ashen, his breathing faltered, and his body sagged lifelessly against the restraints. At 7:06 p.m., his heart gave out. The execution was declared botched, a gruesome, lingering death burned forever into the memory of every witness in the chamber. The fallout was immediate. Journalists called it torture, describing in detail the sounds of his gasps and the sight of his body twisting on the gurney. Human rights groups demanded investigations, calling it cruel and inhuman punishment. Even President Barack Obama described the execution as deeply troubling, and international media carried the story across front pages, branding it a national disgrace. Oklahoma temporarily halted all executions, facing lawsuits, federal scrutiny, and international outrage. For Stephanie Neiman's family, there was little comfort. They had waited 15 years for justice, only to see the process descend into a public disaster, a spectacle that overshadowed the memory of their daughter's final moments. The case of Clayton Lockett became a turning point in America's death penalty debate, not just a headline, but a lasting reminder of just how gruesome, unpredictable, and flawed executions can be, and how one night in Oklahoma reshaped the conversation around capital punishment forever. What do you think? Was Clayton Lockett's botched execution a sign that the death penalty itself is broken, or was it simply justice served in a brutal way? Subscribe to Death Row Stories for more shocking final hours, infamous last words, and the real stories behind the world's most controversial executions.